All right, so I'm going to go through this one relatively quickly. So this is basically sort of related to your requirements, but it's also related to almost everything that you're going to do in your project, and that is managing change, managing your configuration and your change in your configuration, because you are going to have changes, right? And so this first slide sort of summarizes what we'll talk about in this lecture. All right. So the first part of this is to establish a system baseline. This baseline is your complete system description, including your requirements, your designs, constraints, assumptions, interfaces, resource allocations, et cetera, et cetera. That is the baseline project that you have. All right. So these kinds of baselines are important because it helps you communicate just exactly where you are in the project. The other thing to keep in mind is that these baselines will change as you go through the project. We go through a PDR, CDR, and FRR process, and at each time those baselines will change. You will update your baseline as you do it. So this is sort of a example as to what the baselines are when you go through a project. So this is going through like the standard NASA phases, A through F, which is basically from concept development and initial preliminary design, which is sort of phase A, and then in through phase B, which gets you to your preliminary design review. So initially you start off with concepts and a functional baseline, and then you can go into an allocated baseline, which is sort of expressed at the preliminary design review. And then after your design phase in phase 3, you harden up your design, and so now you're into a product. You're going to be moving on to fabricating something. So that's your next baseline. In phase D, which is after CDR, you're now building your flight hardware, building your flight software, and all of that is sort of summarized in, as far as LACES is concerned, in your FRR. So you have an as-built baseline as to how that payload is functioning and how it's going to work during flight. So here's sort of the formal definitions approved, and it goes through. They talk about a system definition review, and that's sort of maybe what we're doing with a pre-PDR. But then you see that the allocated baseline goes to in that phase B, as I mentioned, and is established at the PDR. The next build to is the critical design review. Remember, when we first started talking about this, I had always said that I usually threatened to take all the CDR documents and give them to completely different teams, and then have those teams build the hardware and give it back to the original owner. And so that original owner would have to live with whatever it is that they documented in the CDR. And so here's another expression of that the CDR is basically establishing the build to baseline, if you will. And then finally, as you move on into the flight readiness review, you have the as-built baseline, and finally the deployed baseline. This diagram sort of shows how this process evolves and how you develop more bits and pieces into this baseline as you progress. You can take a look at this from the online as you go through this. It isn't just requirements and designs. There's a lot more into these baselines. You have that technical aspect, but you also have schedule and risk and affordability in terms of your time, as well as the requirements and the design. So there's a lot more than just your electronic circuit drawings or your or your software flowcharts when you put together a baseline like this. System configuration is a necessity. So what we mean by system configuration and management is to make certain that you keep track of all these requirements and to do things like what we call version control. You need to capture all of your baseline design as you go forward with it, and then make certain that it is clear which version of your baseline that you're talking about. This can be done by, for example, taking your PDR and putting a version number on it. PDR version 1 or version 1.1 or 1.5 or version 2, right? And making certain that version control is there and obvious. All right, so as this diagram shows, this is basically how one progresses through these kinds of projects with these documents. So during concept, you're sort of sitting around doing a paper study like we're doing now, and what you get out of this is that you're going to get your expectation of risks or problems. You're going to get your requirements, your goals, your science. What you're expecting to accomplish. That feeds into your next step, which is after you sort of get up to the getting into the more of the design phase, where you're really sort of settling down into your system requirements and your system design, and then working through things like how would you validate all of that, and then finally working into the your design plans leading up to a CDR, where you're doing prototyping and that set, which then leads into things like your CDR and your as-built configuration. Once you do your prototyping, you assemble your system, test it, do system testing, launching into operations. So you've got an as-built, as verified, and then finally into operations, where you have your baseline as the system is actually working and deployed. And throughout a whole bunch of this stuff, you've got changes going on with all of these things. So you got to remember that is, and you got to remember how to communicate across your team with these changes, as well as how to archive the changes. So most of these changes that will come, it's sort of to some extent might even be obvious or not so obvious. Your design is going to mature. It is going to change. You may have initially thought you'd be using one kind of sensor or collecting data at one kind of rate, and then as you start working through the details of your project, the sensor details may change. How you collect your data may change, right? And that all happen. A stakeholder decides that something else has to happen, right? We may need to shift when the launch is. We've done that for the last 2 years because of a risk called COVID. And so that is a change. We would have to change how we deal with the flight schedule. All right. Pause and learn. Kobe. Yeah. So Kobe was an interesting case. They actually changed the launch vehicle on them. So they had to redesign their interfaces and be able to go to a new case. So change control in your requirements. So the kinds of things that you want to be able to do is basically capture how you change those requirements. You may go from your system requirements through the PDR, and those kinds of requirements can change as you progress through the system. We aren't going to go through change control boards or engineering change requests. Your process is pretty simple. This is sort of like a NASA type process as to how they would go through configuration control. You can see this. They have a configuration control board, and that's got to be reviewed, and then they got to decide whether or not they're going to implement the change or not, or however it goes. You aren't going to really do that. Your team is too small. And then this is sort of more of that same. All right, so this is how we might many times do it, but this is not how you are going to do it. You are going to write down your process, and you aren't just going to arbitrarily change it in your mind, right? As you go through your project, you're going to be writing it down, you're going to be communicating, and you're going to track how your changes go. Otherwise, your faculty advisor is going to hire some goons and beat it out of you. So, just avoid that in the first place, and process the parts.